I pulled into the driveway on a gray January afternoon, the kind of winter light that makes everything look colder than it already is. My duffel bag sat in the passenger seat, the same one I had carried through rotations in Alaska and training in Arizona, the same one that had been shoved under cots and rattled in helicopters for years. I had told myself the drive home to Tacoma would feel like crossing a finish line. I had finished my last active duty assignment at the end of the year and signed my separation papers with a mix of relief and confusion, wondering who I would be once the dust of military life settled. I thought stepping out of the car would feel like stepping into the next chapter. Instead, I froze. My things were everywhere, scattered across the front lawn like debris after a storm. Clothes, gear, paperwork, boxes I knew too well, even the tan container that held my folded flag. I sat behind the wheel a full minute trying to make sense of it. It looked like someone had taken my past and shaken it out like trash. The cold air seeped in around the cracked window as I studied the scene. The neighborhood was quiet, but not in a comforting way. More like the hush before someone admits something shameful. I finally stepped out of the car boots, pressing into the damp grass. My breath left in a slow cloud as I moved forward. That was when I spotted the green storage bin I had kept tucked in the back of the closet. The same one that held my old unit patches and the dog tags of friends who never made it home. The lid was cracked. A couple of tags had spilled onto the lawn. Seeing them lying in the open like that made something in my ribs tighten. I bent down and brushed my fingers over the metal, the chill of it biting into my skin. Before I picked anything up, I looked toward the house. Dad stood on the porch. His hands rested on his hips like he was waiting for me to thank him. The strangest part was the expression. Not guilty, not confused. Annoyed, almost bored. Like this was an inconvenience for him. I stared at him wondering how long he had waited for me to drive up. I wondered if he expected tears or gratitude, maybe both. By the fourth or fifth breath, I could feel that familiar steadying shift inside me, the one that had carried me through too many things to count. Just a quiet settling. I know many of you listening have had a moment like that, when something hits so hard you can only stand still. Before I tell you what Dad said next, let me ask what you are doing while listening. For me, when this happened, I had just come off a 14-hour road trip and thought I was finally coming home. I love hearing what you are doing as you listen, so feel free to share later if you want. Dad walked down one step, then another. He told me that he had cleaned up the place and that everything out here was trash. He said I should be grateful he had taken the time to sort my things and get rid of clutter. The words landed slow, each one sounding more unreal than the one before it. Trash, grateful, cleaned up. I could feel a tingling at the base of my neck, the way I used to when a mission brief turned toward something dangerous. Not fear, not even anger, just clarity. Dad looked at me like he expected me to argue, maybe to beg him to explain. But I just watched him letting the cold air fill the silence between us. I finally met his eyes. I told him that if this was how he sorted things, then I would start deciding what was useless to me too. My voice came out calmer than I expected. Maybe too calm because something in his expression shifted. Just a flicker, but enough to show he had not planned for that response. For the first time since I stepped out of the car, he looked unsure, almost defensive. He tightened his jaw, crossed his arms, then uncrossed them like he was not sure what position made him look more in control. Across the street, Darla stood behind her fence. She was bundled up in a blue jacket, holding her mail like she had forgotten what she came outside for. She did not wave. She did not call out. She just watched, like she was witnessing something she wished she could pretend she had not seen. Her eyes dropped to the dog tags on the ground, then quickly lifted again. There was sympathy, but also discomfort. People always feel awkward watching a family fracture in daylight. I bent down and started gathering my things. Not all at once. Just one item at a time. A framed picture. A pair of desert boots. A worn notebook with water stains from a mission in Idaho. I did not rush. I wanted Dad to see that I was not scrambling or panicking. The steadiness in me came from training, but it felt like something else too. Something older. Like a part of me had expected this for a long time, even if I never admitted it out loud. Dad finally spoke again. He said that while I was gone, he needed to make the house more functional. He said Maribel needed space with the new baby coming. He said the house had changed that I had not been around to notice. He said all of that like it justified throwing my life across the front yard. I listened. It is strange how listening can sometimes make you see a person more clearly than arguing ever could. When I straightened up, my eyes swept over the lawn once more. The house behind him was mine. My name alone was on the deed. I bought it before my first deployment because I wanted Dad and Mom to have stability after years of money anxiety. Mom passed not long after, and the house became Dad's lifeline in his mind. Not legally, just emotionally. And sometimes emotional claims become the most dangerous kind. The mini-climax of that moment did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly in the way my breath leveled and my back stood straighter. I realized that Dad was talking to me like I was the one intruding, like I had returned to a place that no longer belonged to me. But none of that changed the truth. This house was mine. I had paid every bill, every repair, every tax. Dad lived here because I allowed him to, not because he had ownership. Seeing my belongings thrown outside as trash made it clear that he had rewritten the story for himself while I was gone. I gathered an armful of items and walked toward the front door. He stepped aside, not because he wanted to, but because he did not know what else to do. His eyes narrowed the way they used to when I came home from training with bruises, and he did not know whether to ask questions or pretend not to worry. He said something under his breath, maybe trying to reclaim an ounce of authority, but the wind carried it away before it reached me. I did not ask him to repeat it. Inside the house, the air felt still, as if everything had paused the moment I left for deployment years ago and never learned how to move again. The living room was rearranged. The walls were a different color. Some of my old pictures were gone, replaced by photos of Maribel's growing family. There were toys by the staircase and a car seat leaning against the banister. I studied the scene carefully, not with resentment but with an almost clinical curiosity. It was like stepping into someone else's story instead of my own. Behind me, Dad stayed on the porch. I could feel the weight of his presence through the open doorway. He did not follow me inside. Maybe he wanted me to turn around and argue with him. Maybe he wanted me to ask why he had done all of this without a single call or message. But I did not give him the conversation he wanted. Instead, I kept walking. I set the first load of belongings just inside the hallway. My boots echoed against the hardwood as I moved deeper into the house. I noted everything that had changed. The kitchen table was different. The pantry shelves were rearranged. Even the placement of the coffee mugs felt like a quiet announcement that someone else had claimed the rhythms of this space. When I turned back toward the doorway, Dad was no longer standing there. The porch was empty. Only the cold afternoon light spilled across the threshold. I stepped outside again to gather more belongings. The chill seeped through my jacket, but I ignored it. I focused on picking up each item from the grass, shaking off bits of dirt or leaves, deciding what could still be saved. I could hear a faint hum of a lawn blower from a house down the street, the distant bark of a dog and the soft rustle of wind against the hedges. Darla stayed by her fence for a long time. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as if unsure whether to approach. Eventually she gave a small nod. Not a greeting, more like an acknowledgement that she had seen enough to understand something was deeply wrong. I carried a second and third load inside. With each step, the silence of the house thickened, a different kind of quiet than outside. Outside had the sting of embarrassment. Inside had the weight of something unresolved, like walking into a room after an argument and feeling the residue still, floating there. By the time I carried the last box through the doorway, the sky had turned darker. A soft drizzle began to fall, turning the lawn slick and muddy. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stood still in the entryway, listening to the small ticking sound of water hitting the roof. Dad stayed somewhere out of sight and did not return to speak with me again. I closed the door gently, not because I wanted to protect the peace of the house, but because slamming it would have felt like giving him something he expected. Anger, outburst, noise. I did not want any of that. I wanted clarity. And I wanted the truth to speak for itself. With the door shut behind me, the house felt strangely hollow. Not empty, just wrong in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. I took a slow breath. The kind of breath I had learned to take before stepping into an unknown, building during training. Not because I feared danger, but because I needed my mind steady. This was my home. And somehow I was the only one who seemed to remember that. I knew I would have to face the conversations waiting for me soon. Maribel. Dad. The explanations they believed I owed them. But for that moment, I let the quiet settle around me. My things were safe inside again, even if the house felt changed beyond recognition. As the drizzle outside turned into a steady rain, I realized I was preparing myself not for rest, but for confrontation. Maybe not loud, maybe not dramatic, but confrontation all the same. And I felt something steady rise inside me, a reminder that I had learned to survive harsher places than this. I took another breath, stepped farther into the hallway, and felt the old hardwood flex just slightly under my weight. It was the first familiar sensation since I had arrived. A grounding one. The house remembered me even if the people inside pretended not to. The silence deepened. And that was where the first chapter of coming home truly began. Chapter 2. I walked farther down the hallway, the quiet settling around me in a way that felt both familiar and unsettling. The hardwood under my boots creaked the way it always had, a small reminder that this place had once responded to my footsteps alone. I moved slowly, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I needed to understand what had happened in my absence. Every breath felt deliberate. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the thermostat, even the distant shower running upstairs. It all blended together into a strange new rhythm that did not match the home. I remembered. I reached the bottom of the staircase and rested my hand against the rail, feeling the smooth wood under my palm. I started to climb, noting the scuff marks along the wall that had not been there before. Little arcs of scraped paint that told a story of furniture being moved. Maybe more than once. I paused at the landing listening. A soft chime from a baby mobile drifted faintly down the hallway. That sound did not belong to my past. It belonged to someone else's future. When I stepped into the doorway of what had once been my room, the shift in me was immediate. The walls were no longer the muted blue I had painted before my first deployment. They were now a soft peach color, warm and bright, with little star decals scattered across one corner. A white crib sat near the window draped with a floral blanket. A rocking chair rested in the opposite corner, a half-knitted baby blanket thrown over the arm as if someone had been working on it just moments ago. The floor was covered with a round beige rug, and shelves had been filled with stuffed animals, diapers, and folded onesies. There was no sign of my life anywhere. No dresser, no framed photos, no books, not even a stray hair tie or loose sock that might have been shoved aside in a hurry. It looked like I had never existed here at all. I stepped fully into the room and turned slowly, taking everything piece by piece. The air smelled faintly of lavender baby lotion. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a wash of pale afternoon light. A mobile hung above the crib, tiny wooden moons turning slowly in the faint current of the heater. It felt staged like a magazine nursery carefully arranged for effect. But this was not a photo shoot. This was my house, my room. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Dad stood in the doorway, but he kept one hand braced against the frame, as if unsure whether to enter. His eyes passed over the nursery with a kind of eager approval, but when they landed on me, he looked away. He cleared his throat and said something about how Maribel needed more space, with the baby coming soon. He sounded stiff, like he was reciting a speech he had already practiced in his head. I did not answer him. Instead, I brushed my hand along the back of the rocking chair. The wood felt new, untouched. I asked where my things were. Dad mumbled something about putting them aside, then rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he was caught in a half-truth. He said we could talk later, that Maribel had been working hard preparing for the baby, and that the house needed to be functional. Functional was a word he used when he did not want to say fair. He took a step back, almost as if he expected me to follow him out of the room, but I stayed where I was. Eventually he turned and walked down the hall, leaving me alone with the silence and the peach-colored walls. A moment later, Maribel appeared at the doorway. She had her hair pulled into a loose bun and one hand resting on her lower back. Her expression was soft, even apologetic, though I could not tell how much of that softness was real and how much came from knowing she needed to appear gentle right now. She let out a small sigh, almost theatrical, then stepped inside. She told me she had been meaning to call, but things had gotten busy. She said the pregnancy had been harder than she expected, and that the house had always felt like a second home. So it made sense to settle here until she and her husband figured out something long-term. She spoke with a careful brightness, the kind people use when they are trying to keep criticism from sounding like criticism. I looked around the room again. My room. The crib, the rug, the new paint, the chair. I asked her directly where I was supposed to sleep. The question hung in the air for a long moment, and Maribel's smile faltered at the edges. She glanced toward the hallway as if hoping Dad would reappear and take the question off her shoulders. She said maybe the garage would work for now. She said it like she was offering me a solution instead of pushing me out. Maybe the garage. For now. I repeated the words in my mind. They tasted bitter. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I just looked at her. Sometimes silence reveals more than any outburst. Her cheeks went pink as she adjusted the hem of her sweater. She said she hoped I understood. I nodded once because there was nothing else to say. She shifted her weight as if relieved the moment was over, then stepped out of the doorway, leaving the scent of lavender behind her. I stood in the center of the nursery and let the truth settle over me layer by layer. I was not a guest in this house. I was the owner. My name alone was on the deed. I bought this home for our family after I finished technical school, using my re-enlistment bonus and savings. But somewhere along the years of deployments and training rotations, Dad and Maribel had quietly rewritten the story in a way that suited them. In their version, the house had become theirs to shape, mine to return to only if it fit their plans. Standing in that nursery, I could feel the shape of the misunderstanding. It was not about the crib or the paint or the stuffed animals. It was about the assumption that my absence meant surrender. That being gone meant giving up my place. That serving away from home meant forfeiting the right to come back. I walked out of the room and moved through the upstairs hallway, checking closet after closet. Not a single item of mine remained. I had expected chaos after seeing my belongings thrown across the lawn, but the upstairs was spotless, too spotless, a tidy erasure. The linen closet was filled with folded baby blankets and extra towels. The hallway closet held board games and storage bins labeled by Maribel in her looping handwriting. I opened every door, scanning for the smallest trace of myself. Nothing. By the time I returned downstairs, the living room felt even more foreign than before. The couch was not mine. The framed pictures on the wall were not mine. The coffee table was covered in parenting magazines. A baby swing sat in the corner with a yellow blanket draped over it. The smell of a stew simmering in the kitchen drifted through the house. Someone else's comfort woven into the space that used to be mine. I set my duffel bag near the garage door. The bag thudded softly against the floor. The weight of it, a reminder that not everything I owned had been pushed aside. I stepped into the garage and flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered twice before glowing. The garage was cluttered, but not unbearable. Boxes stacked along the walls. A couple of garden tools leaning against a shelf. The air was cooler than the rest of the house, and the faint scent of motor oil hung in the air. I found a small clearing near the back wall, just enough space for a sleeping bag and the duffel. I dragged a few boxes aside, making room for myself. The concrete floor was cold, but I had slept worse during field training. I reminded myself of that as I rolled out the thin sleeping mat I kept for emergencies. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. I could hear voices faintly from inside the house. Maribel talking to Dad in soft tones, the kind that were meant to soothe. The kind that made me feel like they were discussing a problem rather than a person. Dad answered in low, muffled words. I could not make out the specifics, and I did not try to. I had learned long ago that listening in on half conversations only filled your mind with guesses you could not resolve. I sat on the edge of the sleeping mat and looked around the garage. This would do for tonight. I was not fragile. I had slept in far more uncomfortable places, in far more uncertain circumstances. But the meaning was what stung. It was not the garage itself. It was being told without being told. That this was all that was available to me, in a house that legally belonged to me. As I leaned back against a box labeled winter coats, my eyes drifted toward the narrow window above the garage door. The sky was turning darker, the last light fading behind a sheet of clouds. A small drop of rain slid down the glass, catching the dim light as it fell. I listened to the growing patter outside, letting the sound steady my breathing. There was a moment, a quiet one, when I felt the shift again. The kind of shift that comes when reality rearranges itself and reveals the shape of what comes next. I could see it clearly now. Dad and Maribel were living in my house as if they were the ones making decisions, setting rules, determining where I fit. They had forgotten the truth of the foundation beneath them, and I had let that slide for too long. I reached over and zipped my duffel bag closed, the familiar rasp of the zipper breaking the silence. The garage door rattled faintly in the wind. The cold seeped up through the concrete floor, but I barely noticed. This was temporary. Not because I lacked strength, but because I finally recognized what was happening. They claimed space in the house as if my years away meant forfeiture. But I am back now. And nothing about the situation made sense for the long term. Not for them. And certainly not for me. I lay back on the mat for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the hum of the garage settle into my thoughts. I was tired, bone-deep tired, but not defeated, not even close. When I finally closed my eyes, the rain outside had turned steady, tapping a quiet rhythm against the roof, a rhythm that reminded me of waiting out storms during training. Storms always passed, and when they did, the landscape never looked the same. I let that thought steady me as sleep crept close. The garage may have been where they wanted me for now, but I knew this was only the starting point of a much larger reckoning. I woke the next morning to the faint rattle of rain easing off the garage roof. The cold from the concrete had crept into my back during the night, but it was the voices inside the house that finally pushed me fully awake. Light footsteps a cupboard closing, the soft clink of dishes. Sounds that used to feel like home, but now made me feel like a stranger, listening through a thin wall. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, letting the stiffness in my shoulders roll out 1 inch at a time. For a moment I just listened. The murmur of Maribel's voice floated faintly through the door, warm and cheerful, like someone starting her morning in a place she felt completely entitled to. Dad's lower voice rumbled in response, too quiet to make out but steady. My name came up once. I recognized the brief pause afterward, the kind of pause people use when they are not sure whether to continue the sentence or lower their voices. They lowered them. I stood and stretched. The garage felt smaller today, not physically, but in the way that a place feels when you know it is only being offered to you because someone has decided you should not have anything better. I rolled my sleeping mat, washed my face in the utility sink, and stepped inside the house. The kitchen was bright with the overhead light and the steam from a pot of oatmeal on the stove. Maribel stood barefoot in front of the counter, stirring a bowl of fruit while humming softly. She glanced at me quickly, then smiled like everything was normal. Dad sat at the table with a mug of coffee, reading the local paper. Neither of them acted as if anything unusual had happened the day before. If I had not seen my belongings scattered across the lawn, I might have believed it was an ordinary morning. He folded the paper and said something about rain coming back later. He did not ask how I slept, and he did not mention the garage. He just said Maribel needed to rest more and that her back was giving her trouble. As if that justified every decision made around me. As if my presence was simply another factor he had to work around. Growing up, that was the rhythm of our family. I learned early that my role was to adjust. Maribel's role was to be protected. I remembered being 10, standing on the edge of our backyard trampoline, waiting my turn while Maribel cried because she wanted to go first. He picked her up immediately and helped her bounce, telling me to be patient because she was younger and needed help. I remembered being 16, stranded at school after track practice, and calling him for a ride. He told me to walk home because he was helping Maribel study for her English exam. I walked the 3 miles in the rain, and when I got home he said I was tough and could handle it. Years later, when I told him I had chosen pararescue, he nodded proudly and said it made sense because I was good at taking care of myself. It was never cruel, just patterned, and patterns have long shadows. Back in the kitchen, Maribel stretched her hand across her belly with a dramatic sigh. She said the baby had been kicking all morning and that stress was not good for either of them. She glanced at Dad, then back at me, the message wrapped in politeness but unmistakable. She said that with the baby coming soon, the house needed peace and predictability. She added that she hoped I would understand how hard this transition was for them. Them, not us, them. Dad looked at me over the top of his glasses and said that I always managed, fine on my own. He said it with the same tone he used when he was proud of me for repairing a fence, or fixing a broken cabinet, as if independence was a badge I should wear at all times. You always manage. You do not need much. He said it like it was a compliment. It sat between us like a stone. I made a pot of coffee without saying much. The machine sputtered and hissed, the smell filling the kitchen. It used to be my favorite part of mornings at home. Now it only reminded me how much of the house's rhythm had changed without me. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside to get some air. The sky was a heavy gray, the kind that promises rain without committing yet. Darla was in her yard pulling weeds from the flower bed along the fence. She straightened when she saw me and gave a hesitant wave. I walked toward her, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She told me she had seen the scene yesterday. She said she wanted to come over, but was not sure it was her place. She kept her voice low, like she was sharing something she was not supposed to say. She told me Dad had mentioned to a few neighbors that I had moved on with my life and that the house was really Maribel's now. Not legally, just practically. He said I had not needed the space for years and that it made sense to turn it into something useful. I stood there with the cool air brushing against my face, listening as Darla spoke. I felt something in my chest tighten, not sharp like anger but steady like recognition, a slow and heavy truth settling into place. Dad had not just rearranged the house. He had rewritten the story of ownership altogether. He had told people I was gone, that I had outgrown this place, that my stake in it had disappeared the moment I stepped on a plane to deploy, as if leaving for duty meant leaving permanently, as if service meant surrender. Darla must have noticed the shift in my expression because she reached out and touched my arm lightly. She said she did not know all the details, but she thought I should know what had been said. She apologized more than once. I told her she did not need to. She had done nothing wrong. When I walked back to the house, the front door felt heavier than usual. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, letting the morning air settle around me. I could hear faint laughter from inside. Maribel's voice again. The smell of oatmeal still lingered. Everything simple and domestic, as if the house had been built for their comfort alone. I stepped inside and closed the door quietly. Dad walked through the living room on his way to the den and gave me a nod. A nod meant to close the conversation he thought I wanted to have. A nod meant to signal that everything was already decided. I watched him disappear down the hall, then looked up the staircase toward the room that used to be mine. The peach-colored walls, the crib, the rocking chair, the lavender scent. A nursery built inside the shell of my old life. A nursery built on the assumption that I would not come back, that I did not need space, that I would adjust like always. The realization came slowly at first, then all at once. It was not just my room that had been taken. It was my place in my own home. The narrative of ownership. The sense of belonging. The right to walk through my house without feeling like an intruder. I walked out to the driveway and leaned against my car, letting the cold metal steady me. The neighborhood was quiet again, the way it had been when I first pulled in yesterday. The wind carried a faint smell of wet pavement, and the clouds sat low against the sky. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered for a moment, then I scrolled to a familiar contact, Noah Briggs, someone who had seen me at my lowest during training and at my strongest during rescue missions, someone who understood silence as well as words. When he answered, his voice was warm and steady. He asked how it felt to be home. I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding. There was a pause. Then I told him I did not know where home was anymore. I stayed outside after the call with Noah ended, letting the cool Tacoma air settle around me. The gray sky hung low, and for a moment I felt suspended between breaths, like the world had paused just long enough for me to catch up with myself. When I finally walked back into the garage, the dim light from the single bulb flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the stacks of boxes piled against the walls. My name was written in black marker across several of them, but the handwriting was not mine. It was Dad's, rushed and uneven, as if labeling my life had been an afterthought. I knelt beside the nearest box and pulled the flaps open. The smell hit me first. Dust, old canvas. A faint trace of hydraulic fluid from a field pack I had carried through too. Many places to count. I took a slow breath and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the worn fabric of my deployment duffel, the one I had carried on my first mission overseas. I pulled it out carefully, the weight of it familiar, even empty. Inside the duffel were 3 smaller items wrapped in cloth, I hesitated before unwrapping the first. When the fabric fell away, I found myself looking at a pair of rescue shears with a chipped handle. The blade had a small dent near the hinge. It had happened the night we pulled Staff Sergeant Dixon from a wrecked transport truck. The metal had twisted when I cut through the reinforced seat belt, while the fuel tank dripped behind us. He did not make it, but the shears had stayed with me. My hand tightened around them involuntarily, and for a second, my pulse jumped like it used to when a radio crackled at the wrong moment. I set the shears aside gently and reached for the second wrapped bundle. This one was lighter, softer. Inside was a folded piece of fabric faded by sun and sand, a bandana. Not mine. It belonged to Morales, one of the strongest medics I had ever served with. He wrapped it around his wrist during every long ruck, claiming it brought luck. He gave it to me on my last deployment before his own team rotated out. He said he wanted me to carry something bright, because the world was already too gray. I held the bandana a little too long, the memory pressing close but not suffocating. My breathing stayed steady, measured, though a tremor moved through my fingers before I could stop it. The third item was the hardest to unwrap. The paper crinkled in resistance as if it remembered what it protected. When the last layer opened, my dog tags slid into my palm with a faint metallic click. The sound echoed in the garage, small but sharp. I closed my hand around them, my breath shortening for a moment. Not a flashback, just the weight of too many nights when these tags rested against my sternum, like a reminder that I had to stay alive, not for myself, but for the people who were counting on me. I blinked a few times, grounding myself by looking at the concrete floor, then at the open boxes. The cold air helped, the kind that cut through fog in the mind. The side door of the garage creaked. I straightened at the sound, instinct pulling my shoulders tight until I recognized the silhouette stepping in. Noah ducked under the low frame, pushing the door fully open with the back of his hand. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee and looked at me with the kind of steady concern that did not require a single dramatic gesture. His dark hair was damp from the drizzle outside, and his jacket smelled faintly of cedar and airport terminals. He had driven from SeaTac straight after landing. That was who he was. He handed me one of the coffees without comment. I took it and felt the warmth settle into my palms. He looked around the garage, his eyes scanning the piles of boxes and loose items scattered across the floor. Then he looked at me again. He asked if my dad had helped me bring all this in. I said no. Dad had not even asked where I slept last night. Noah nodded slowly, absorbing more than just the words. He bent and picked up the bandana from the floor. He turned it over in his hands, then handed it back gently. No commentary. No questions I was not ready to answer. Just presence. He asked if I wanted help sorting things. I said yes. We worked in silence for a while, opening boxes, moving items into small stacks. Noah made careful, efficient choices, separating gear into categories like we were back in a supply tent. Every now and then he asked a simple question. Where do you want this? Is this important? Do you want to keep this out or pack it up? The kind of questions that helped pull me forward without pulling me apart. At one point he lifted a small wooden frame from a half-open box. It held a photo of my unit standing in front of a helicopter at sunrise. Our boots dusted with sand, our faces half covered by goggles and exhaustion. Several people in that photo are gone now. The light in the picture made everything look golden, which was funny because I remembered that morning being cold. Noah looked at the photo for a moment, then set it carefully on the workbench where nothing could fall on it. While he moved another box, he paused and asked a question that at first seemed simple. This is your house, right? Not Dad's, not shared, yours. I froze. Not dramatically, not even visibly probably, but something inside me stopped. I had bought the house with my re-enlistment bonus years ago. I remembered the closing papers. I remembered the mortgage approval. I remembered setting the keys on my desk before I deployed. But I had never once taken the deed out again, never checked how it was registered, never made sure the story of ownership stayed intact. I said yes, that it was mine. But the truth was, I had not looked at the papers since the day I signed them. Noah lifted his eyebrows just a little. Then maybe you should find the deed. The suggestion was not sharp, not accusatory, just steady enough to land. We went through another set of boxes. Old uniforms, books, a rusted toolbox I had inherited from my grandfather. Then a stack of folders wrapped with a rubber band. Not the right ones. Another box. Tax documents. Receipts. A lease agreement for a storage unit I no longer rented. Finally, at the bottom of a short plastic bin, wedged beneath a folder labeled Vehicle Title, I found a bright blue envelope with the bank's logo faintly embossed on the front. My heart gave a small, tight pull. My name was written across the edge in neat print. Mine, not Dad's, not shared. I sat down on an overturned bucket and opened the envelope. Inside were the closing papers, the purchase agreement, the interest rate disclosures, and finally the deed. I turned it so the light from the bulb hit the page clearly. There was one name. Only one. Selena Wright. Noah stood in front of me quietly, watching without intruding. The garage seemed to contract and expand at the same time, like the air shifted to make room for the truth settling over everything. I traced my name with my finger, the ink dry and unchanging after all these years. A strange calm moved through me, not soft but firm. Dad had acted like this was his house. Maribel had acted like I was the one intruding. The neighbors talked as though I had abandoned it. But the paper in my hands was the real story. The story that had never stopped being true, even when I stepped away. The deed was mine. The house was mine. The ground under my feet was mine. All the power I thought I had lost had never actually been given away. It had only been ignored. I held the deed carefully, letting its weight settle into my palms. For the first time since coming home, something inside me aligned. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. I stood the paper still in my hand and looked at the garage, the boxes. The doorway that led back into a house where people acted like I did not belong. I realized in that moment that I had never needed permission to reclaim anything. I only needed to remember what was already mine. And that was where the shift began. I stood in the garage holding the deed, the crisp edges pressing into my fingertips, and for the first time since coming home, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not victory, just a quiet recognition of truth. This house was mine. It had always been mine. I had simply stopped defending that fact, the same way I had stopped defending pieces of myself while trying to keep peace in a family that never asked what I needed. I slipped the deed into a folder and walked inside. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed in its walls, but because I finally understood the ground beneath my feet. Dad walked past me in the hallway carrying a load of laundry. He gave a curt nod as if acknowledging a guest rather than the homeowner. He did not notice the folder in my hand, or maybe he did and chose not to ask. Either way, the silence between us was thick. I went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared out the window at the backyard. The grass had grown uneven in the last month. I normally would have taken care of it before leaving base. Now everything felt like a metaphor I did not want to unpack. The house, the yard, the garage, the boxes, even the quiet corners of the kitchen where my things used to sit. All of it said the same thing. I had made room for them. They had filled every inch. But now that I knew exactly where I stood legally, I needed clarity emotionally. I needed facts, not feelings, not assumptions, not childhood patterns, real answers. That was when I decided to call a lawyer. Not to fight, not to threaten, just to understand. I searched online for someone local, someone who handled property issues in Pierce County. That was how I found the office of Josh Holt. His reviews said he was patient and explained things in plain English. After years of operating in high-pressure environments where too much information could cloud judgment, I needed someone who knew how to speak simply and directly. I called the number. A receptionist answered and said Josh had an opening that afternoon if I could come by. I told her I would be there. When I left the house, Maribel called after me, asking if I could pick up prenatal vitamins on my way back. Her tone was sweet, but not a request. More like an assumption. Dad did not turn from the television. He just said to drive safely. I told them both I had an appointment. Neither asked with whom. The drive to the lawyer's office was quiet. Tacoma traffic was light and the sky was breaking into patches of pale blue. As I turned onto a narrow side street lined with small professional buildings, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not quite anxiety, but the sensation of stepping into unknown territory. The same feeling I used to get before walking into a mission briefing. Inside the office smelled like paper and coffee. Josh was younger than I expected, probably mid-30s. with rolled-up sleeves and clear eyes that made him look like someone who had heard every kind of story, but still knew how to listen. He introduced himself and motioned for me to sit at a small conference table. I placed the folder with the deed on the wood surface. He asked what brought me in. I told him everything. Not dramatic, not embellished. I told him I had left active duty, came home to find my belongings thrown in the yard, discovered my room turned into a nursery, and learned my family had been speaking to the neighbors as though I no longer lived there. I told him they acted as though they had the authority to assign me the garage, like it was a spare tent on a field exercise. Josh nodded throughout, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When I finished, he asked if he could look at the deed. I slid it across the table. He examined it quietly, flipping through the supporting documents. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and spoke in a calm voice. Your house is entirely yours. 100%. No co-owners. No life estate. No transfer rights given to anyone else. It is clean. Even though I had already seen the deed, hearing it spoken aloud made something shift in my stomach. It felt equal parts relief and disbelief. He continued, as for your dad, your sister, her husband, any kids, anyone living there, they are what we call occupants by permission. They are not tenants. They have no lease. They are not paying rent. They have no legal right to dictate space, rearrange rooms, or remove your belongings. I listened carefully, letting every word anchor itself. He added that because I had allowed them to stay in good faith, they were not trespassing, but permission could be revoked at any time. They had no claim to the home, not 1 inch of it. I sat back in my chair. I was not angry. I was not even shocked. Mostly I was tired. Tired of carrying responsibility without ownership. Tired of letting Dad's comfort outweigh my own. Tired of acting like a guest in my own life. I told Josh that I did not want to kick out my family. That was the truth. I did not want to see them homeless or hurt. I just wanted to understand the structure I was operating within. I wanted to know if I was crazy for thinking things were wrong. I wanted to know if I had been imagining the imbalance. He shook his head gently. You are not crazy. And nothing you described is normal when the homeowner is you. He paused for a moment and lowered his voice slightly, not dramatically, just enough to make the words land with clarity. Right now they are acting like they are in charge. Legally, only you are. They are in your home because you allow it, not because they have any right to it. I stared at the table. That sentence hit deeper than I expected. I had spent years making myself small to keep peace. Years stretching my boundaries thin. Years accepting decisions made for me under the guise that I was strong enough to handle them. But this was different. This was factual, unemotional, written in ink. Josh asked what outcome I wanted. I told him I just needed my space back, my room, my dignity, the ability to walk into my house without feeling like I had been pushed aside. He nodded and said the first step was understanding my rights, which I now did. The next step, if I chose, was to put boundaries in writing. A notice, not an eviction. Simply a clear statement that the house belonged to me and that any arrangement from this point forward needed structure. He explained that I could decide whether I wanted them to stay with conditions or to move out eventually. Either option was entirely within my authority. I did not have to choose today. What mattered was that I stopped giving up rights that were already mine. That sentence sat with me. It was not about gaining power. It was about stopping the habit of surrendering it. He handed the deed back to me, sliding it across the table like something valuable, something that needed to stay in my possession. I held it with both hands. We finished the meeting with Josh offering to draft anything I might need in the future. He said to call if things escalated or if I needed advice. He did not push. He did not dramatize. He just made sure I understood that I was not powerless unless I chose to be. When I stepped outside, the air smelled like damp concrete and a hint of pine drifting in from the sound. The clouds were breaking apart. Thin strips of sunlight warmed the top of my head as I walked to my car. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and rested the deed on my lap. The paper felt heavier now, not physically but in meaning. I traced my name again the way I had in the garage. This time the gesture felt different. Fierce, steady, awake. The mini-climax did not crash into me. It settled. A slow realization that the battle was not with my family. It was with the part of myself that had forgotten what was already true. I did not need to reclaim authority. I only needed to stop abandoning it. I folded the deed carefully, placed it in the folder, and buckled my seatbelt. When I started the engine, a feeling moved through me like the quiet before a controlled burn. Not destructive, transformative. On the drive home, I looked at the house with new eyes. The roof that needed patching. The porch light Dad never fixed. The fence I had repaired on my last leave. My house. My responsibility. My right. I parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and picked up the folder again. Then I stepped out, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the front steps with the deed in my hand, ready for whatever came next. I stepped back into the house with the folder tucked under my arm, the weight of the deed grounding me with every step. I did not walk in aggressively, and I did not slam a door. I just entered my own home the way any homeowner would, steady and sure. The living room was quiet except for the soft hum of the dryer in the hallway. Dad was in his recliner, half watching a game show, half pretending not to notice me. I carried the folder to my room in the garage and set it on the small table I had dragged in 2 nights earlier. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the faint smell of cardboard, laundry detergent, and the cold concrete floor. Even if it was not ideal, it was still a corner of the house that was unquestionably mine. The next morning, I woke early and began rearranging the kitchen cabinets. Not because I wanted to make a statement, but because living out of a backpack for years meant I appreciated order. I moved the mixing bowls to the lower shelf where I could reach them easily. I shifted spices so I could actually find the chili powder without digging, through 5 containers of cinnamon. I wiped down the counter. None of it was dramatic. It was simply the kind of thing a person would do in their own home. Dad walked in halfway through, rubbing his eyes like the sight of me cleaning was an inconvenience. He opened the fridge, stared into it as if the answer to something was hiding inside, then closed it again without saying a word. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, surveying the cabinets I had just adjusted. He did not ask what I was doing. He just gave a small grunt and walked away. A few minutes later, Maribel shuffled in wearing a robe stretched tight over her belly. She blinked at the cabinet doors still open, then looked at me with a startled expression, as though she had not expected to see me moving anything. Her eyes darted from shelf to shelf, especially the one where she kept her prenatal teas. She asked if I had moved anything important. Her voice had that subtle edge of ownership she had grown comfortable with. I told her I did not move anything of hers, just reorganized common space so we could all use it more easily. She pressed her lips together and nodded slowly, but the tension in her shoulders never eased. Later that day, I cleaned out the hall closet. I gathered a pile of jackets that had not been worn in years and sorted them into donations. I organized the towels so the older ones were accessible for cleaning. I threw away expired cleaning products. Again, nothing dramatic. But the more I acted like a homeowner, the more the atmosphere in the house shifted. Dad began watching me more closely. Not openly, but through the corner of his eye. If I hung a jacket on the correct hook, his jaw tightened. If I adjusted a shelf in the laundry room, his shoulders stiffened. The illusion of control he had been enjoying was thinning. One afternoon, I sat at the dining table reviewing a job application. The sun came in at a soft angle, warming the table surface, and for a moment, the house actually felt peaceful. Maribel and her husband Jason were upstairs assembling a bassinet. Dad stood near the hallway looking out the front window. Then he turned, suddenly pointed toward me, and spoke with a tone I had not heard since I was a teenager. "You really think you can just take over the house now?" The house, mine, purchased by me, supported by my deployments, maintained by my income. I looked up from my application and met his eyes. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just held his gaze quietly. That silence made him more uncomfortable than any fight ever could have. After a long moment, he muttered something under his breath and walked away. I let the words sink in but did not respond. Instead, I returned to my application. It was for a medical support position at a small clinic in Tacoma. A civilian job. A new start. Later that evening, I stepped onto the back porch to call Lena Porter, a contact from my transition program who had been helping veterans shift into civilian careers. The sky was fading into soft lavender, and the air smelled faintly of damp cedar. Lena asked how I was settling in. I laughed quietly, the kind that holds more truth than humor. I told her I was adjusting. I did not explain the tension. I did not mention the garage. I just asked about the job openings she had mentioned. She told me there was a position at a local urgent care center that might be a good fit for my emergency medicine experience. We talked through the application process. She reminded me to highlight my leadership skills. She asked how I felt about staying in Tacoma long term. When I hesitated, she paused. Are you safe there, Selena? The question surprised me. I said yes, because technically it was true. But after I hung up, her words lingered. Inside, Maribel was standing at the bottom of the stairs, listening to Jason talk about the nursery paint color. She glanced at me as I walked past her, the way someone watches a stranger in their home. Not hostile, just wary, protective of her place, afraid of losing something she believed was hers. I walked to the garage, sat on the edge of the cot, and looked down at my hands. They were steady the way they always were before making a clear decision. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Josh Holt's number. When he answered, his voice was calm, warm even. I told him I had thought about our conversation and that I knew what I wanted to do next. There was a pause as he waited. I exhaled slowly. Please prepare a notice. The words came out steady, neutral, not angry. They were simply the truth of what needed to happen. I did not need to justify it. I did not need to explain my family's behavior. I did not need to soften the decision. I just needed to reclaim what was already mine. Josh said he would draft it and email it by morning. I thanked him and ended the call. I set the phone down beside the cot. The garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the water heater. The air was cool. My breath felt controlled. For the first time since coming home, the silence did not feel like exile. It felt like preparation. I lay back on the cot, stared at the ceiling for a moment, and let the stillness wash over me. Tomorrow things will shift. Not violently, not dramatically, just inevitably. I walked back into the house the next morning with the printed notice folded neatly in my hand. The paper felt warm from my grip, and for a moment I just stood in the hallway listening to the low murmur of voices drifting from the kitchen. Maribel was talking to Dad. Her tone was light but strained, the way people sound when they are trying not to upset the balance of a situation they do not fully control. I took a slow breath and walked toward them. My boots made a soft sound on the hardwood floor. Dad turned first. His eyes narrowed when he saw the papers. Maribel's hand went to her stomach, as if instinctively protecting her unborn child from something unseen. I placed the notice on the table between them. The gesture was quiet, steady, and final. Dad stared at it but did not reach for it. What is this? His voice had a sharpness I had not heard in years. It is a written notice outlining expectations for anyone living in the house, I said. My tone stayed calm even. It explains shared spaces and boundaries, and it confirms permission to stay is decided by me as the owner. Maribel blinked quickly, her eyes filling with tears even before she finished reading the first line. Selena, why would you do this? We are family. You know I am pregnant. How could you choose now to put pressure on us? I did not respond to the emotional hook. This was not about cruelty. It was about clarity. Dad snatched the paper off the table and skimmed it in jerky motions. His face reddened. I watched his nostrils flare the way they always did when he felt cornered. This is ridiculous. He slammed the paper down again. You are acting like some outsider who is trying to take over. This is my house too. I stayed still, letting the accusation land without absorbing it. No, Dad. It is not. His mouth tightened. What did you say? I met his stare directly. The house is legally mine, 100%. You know that. You have always known that. Maribel wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Why are you doing this to us? I thought coming home would help us be closer. I took a slow breath. I never raised my voice, not even once. I am not doing anything to you. I am setting boundaries in my home. That is not an attack. That is my responsibility. Dad jabbed a finger toward me the way he had when I was a teenager. When he wanted to pin the blame on me for things I did not do. You are betraying your own family. After everything we have done for you. That sentence hit so many old places inside me that I felt my ribs tighten. Not with anger. With recognition. It was the same manipulation wrapped in new packaging. You threw my things in the yard, I said quietly. You assigned me the garage. You told the neighbors I do not live here anymore. I am not betraying anyone. I am acknowledging reality. Maribel sobbed harder. Jason came down the stairs, drawn by the shouting. He hovered beside her, eyes darting between Dad and me. Outside, I heard movement. A few car doors, a dog barking. The kind of slow gathering that happens in quiet neighborhoods when something shifts in the air. Dad's voice grew louder. So this is your plan. Embarrass us. Control us. Kick us out right when Maribel is about to have her baby. How heartless do you have to be? I did not flinch. The steadiness in me came from somewhere deep, the same place that had carried me through long nights on deployment, through chaos, through things more frightening than family anger. I am not kicking anyone out today, I said softly. The notice is simply a boundary, nothing more. Dad grabbed the paper again, waving it in the air. This says you can revoke our permission to stay. You think you have that kind of power over me? I looked at him not cruelly but plainly. I do not think so, Dad. It is the law. His face twisted. You do not talk to me like I am some tenant. I built this family. I sacrificed for this house. You did not buy it, I said. And you know that too. The kitchen went silent. Maribel's breathing grew shallow. Jason stared at the floor. Then footsteps sounded on the back deck. I turned my head and saw Darla through the screen door, holding a plate covered with foil. She froze when she saw the tension in the room. Everything all right, Selena? Dad spun around. Darla, this is a family business. Please step back. But she did not move. Instead, she looked at the notice still clenched in Dad's hand. She glanced at me, then back at him. Harold, no. Her voice was firm, steady, filled with the confidence of someone who had no trouble speaking truth out. Loud. This house has always been Selena's. She bought it. I was there the day she signed the papers. Your name is not on anything. The words hit the room like a dropped stone in still water. Ripples of silence spread outward. Dad's face went slack. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Maribel covered her face, letting out a broken sob. Jason's hand hovered helplessly in the air before falling to his side. I did not move. I just stood there, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle into the air like dust finally falling after too much disturbance. Darla stepped a little farther inside. Everyone in the neighborhood knows she owns it. She paid for it while she was saving lives overseas. You should be grateful she even lets you stay. I had not expected her to say that last part. It was not something I would have said myself, but it hung in the space between us undeniable. Dad looked at me with a mixture of shock and wounded pride. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he looked small. His voice cracked as he said, "You went behind my back." I shook my head slowly. No, I did not. I have never lied about the house. I just never fought you when you decided to act like it was yours. Maribel wiped her face and looked at me with wide eyes, as though seeing me clearly for the first time. So what happens now? There it was. The question they had avoided for weeks. The question that hung over every silence, every rearranged room, every subtle claim of ownership they tried to make. Now, I said gently, we follow what is written in the notice. Shared respect. Clear boundaries. That is all. Dad looked down at the paper again. But this time, there was no anger in his expression. Just confusion. And maybe the beginning of understanding that a line had been drawn and he could not erase it. I felt my shoulders loosen as the truth finally undeniably stood without my forcing it. I did not need to shout. I did not need to argue. The facts were enough. The deed was enough. The witness of the neighbor who had been there from the start was enough. For the first time since I came home, I felt still inside. Not victorious, not vengeful, just steady. The mini-climax did not explode. It settled, like dust after a storm. Dad lowered the notice and stared at the floor. Maribel's breathing eased into slow, shaky inhales. Jason quietly placed a glass of water on the table and guided her toward a chair. Darla gave me a small nod, a quiet confirmation that I was not alone in the truth. Then she slipped back outside, closing the screen door gently behind her. I stood in the kitchen, watching the last of the tension shift between the people who had spent weeks pretending I was the one intruding. Now the truth sat in the center of the room, impossible to ignore. The balance had changed, not through force, not through anger, through clarity. Dad sank into a chair, stunned. Maribel held her stomach, breathing unevenly. Jason hovered anxiously near her, unsure what to say. And I stood exactly where I belonged, calm and grounded, because for the first time since coming home, the house finally felt like mine again. That was where I left the moment right at the edge of what would come next. Dad sat in the kitchen chair long after Darla left, staring at the notice like it was written in a language he had never seen before. Maribel held a tissue to her face, her eyes swollen, her breaths uneven. Jason stood behind her with one hand on the back of her chair, the way someone steadies furniture during a storm. The entire room felt suspended, as if no one quite knew how to move now that the balance had shifted. I leaned against the counter, not defensive, not triumphant, just present. The truth had arrived, and there was nothing left to argue. Dad finally cleared his throat. His eyes stayed on the table. When he spoke, his voice was softer than I expected. "Selena, we need to talk about this. About all of it." I nodded once. "All right." Maribel straightened slightly, still holding her tissue. She looked younger at that moment, almost like the teenager who used to borrow my sweaters and return them, stretched out and smelling like her citrus perfume. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We just need time. That is all. We are not trying to take anything from you, I promise. We just need stability before the baby comes." I heard the plea behind her words. It was not the manipulative tone she had used before. This was different. Fragile, afraid. Dad looked up at me then, and for the first time since I came home, I saw something crack behind his indignation. Not remorse exactly, more like the slow realization that the story he had built about this house and his place in it had finally fallen apart. "Selena," he said quietly, "can we have more time to figure out what we are doing?" His voice was uneven, stripped of the authority he had clung to for weeks. I took a breath before answering. "I am willing to give reasonable time. Not an indefinite time. Reasonable." Those words settled into the air like stones dropped into water. They were fair. Measured. Boundaries that did not bend. Jason cleared his throat. "How long is reasonable?" I hesitated for a moment. "We can talk specifics after I hear from my attorney. But I am not asking anyone to leave tomorrow." Maribel relaxed slightly, though the tension in her shoulders never fully eased. Dad nodded slowly. He looked older all of a sudden. Smaller. As if the weight of everything he had ignored or assumed had finally landed on him at once. I could feel the house breathing differently now. A quiet shift. A realignment. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to call Evan. The air was cool and clouds drifted low over the street. He picked up quickly and asked how the notice had been received. I told him the truth. The anger, the denial, the shock, and the sudden change in tone once Darla spoke up. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I can come by tomorrow to explain the next steps in person if you want. It might help clarify things so no one can claim confusion later." I agreed. Not because I needed backup, but because I wanted transparency. Clean lines. Facts spoken plainly. When he arrived the next morning, he wore a simple jacket and carried a thin black folder. He greeted Dad and Maribel politely but professionally. The atmosphere in the house tightened immediately, like everyone was holding their breath. We all gathered at the dining table. Evan laid the folder down and opened it calmly. So he began. "I want to confirm a few things for everyone's understanding." He spoke clearly without legal jargon. "The house belongs to Selena, 100%. There are no co-owners, no leaseholders, no transfer agreements. Anyone who lives here does so with her permission. That permission can be structured or revoked as needed." Dad shifted uncomfortably, but he did not interrupt. Evan continued. "There are two options moving forward. 1, an agreed-upon move-out timeline. 2, a lease outlining expectations, responsibilities, and terms." Maribel swallowed hard. She looked at me, then at the table. "If we signed a lease, what would that mean?" Evan answered gently. "It would mean you acknowledge Selena as the property owner and agree to conditions she sets. It formalizes the arrangement, so there are no more misunderstandings." Dad opened his mouth as though to push back, but then he stopped. He closed it again. The realization was sinking deeper now. He rubbed his forehead, staring at his hands. "I do not want to sign anything that makes me feel like a guest in my own house." I met his eyes. "You are not a guest, Dad. You are my family, but legally this is my home. Signing a lease does not erase that. It just gives structure so we all understand the arrangement. For a moment, something like resentment flickered across his face. Then it softened into something else. Something he had never shown me directly. Vulnerability. He exhaled slowly and said in a low voice, "Fine. If that is what you need." The room went silent. It was not accepted exactly. It was a resignation. Acknowledgement. Evan turned to Maribel. "And you?" She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Her voice came out small. "Yes, we will sign it." Dad looked sharply at her, maybe expecting her to resist. But she did not. She just stared at the table with a look of defeat and practicality mixed. Together. Evan opened the folder and slid 2 copies of the lease toward them. I had not read it yet myself, but I trusted him because I trusted his clarity. He had never tried to push me into anything. He had only given me tools. Dad picked up the pen first. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name. Watching him sign felt like watching a long overdue truth settle into its proper place. Not violent, not triumphant, just necessary. Then Evan turned the second copy toward Maribel. She hesitated. Her eyes glistened again, and for a second I thought she might refuse. But then she picked up the pen, pressed it to the paper, and signed. Her signature was small and tight, the ink slightly darker where she had paused too long. That moment was the mini-climax, though no one said so out loud. It was the quiet shift that made the house feel truly mine again. Not because I needed control, but because they finally acknowledged what had always been true. When the papers were done, Evan handed the signed copies to me. I slid them into a clear sleeve and tucked them into the folder I used for all my important documents. Dad rose from the table and walked to the window. He stared outside without speaking. His shoulders slumped not dramatically, just enough that I could see the weight settling into him. Maribel stood slowly, one hand supporting her belly. She looked at me once briefly, as though searching for anger or triumph in my face. She found neither. Jason helped her back upstairs. Evan packed his folder and gave me a nod before leaving. He did not need to say anything. The work was done. I walked to my room in the garage and sat on the edge of the cot. The folder lay heavy in my hands. I opened the drawer of a small metal cabinet I used for storage and placed the lease inside. Then I turned the key and locked it. The sound of the lock clicking into place was soft, almost nothing. But to me it felt like the last puzzle piece sliding into position after years of trying to force the wrong shape to fit. Upstairs the house was quiet, except for the faint murmur of voices. Down here the silence felt steady. And for the first time since coming home, that silence did not feel like waiting. It felt like a beginning. I closed the drawer of the metal cabinet and rested my hand on the cool surface for a moment. The lease was locked away, sealed into something final and quiet. I expected to feel triumphant or relieved. But what settled inside me was something softer. Not peace exactly, but steadiness. A sense that a long line had finally been drawn in ink instead of sand. I stood from the cot and looked around the garage. It still held the smell of cardboard and old paint, but the air felt different now. Less like a holding cell, more like a temporary refuge while I waited for the house to breathe into its new shape. The next morning I decided it was time to reclaim my actual bedroom. Not the nursery Maribel had built over my old space. Not the territory they had carved out without asking. My real room. The one I had furnished years ago when I first bought the house. The one I had assumed would always be there waiting for me. I carried a laundry basket up the steps, my boots making a firm rhythm on the wood. I passed Dad in the hallway. He looked at the basket as though it were a threat. He murmured something I could not make out and moved aside without meeting my eyes. Maribel stayed in the nursery. The door was cracked open. I heard her humming softly, folding tiny onesies with slow, deliberate movements. She did not speak when I walked by. She did not even glance in my direction. It was the kind of silence that carried a mix of resignation and anger she was not ready to show. When I stepped into my old room, I stood still for a moment. The walls were bare. The closet was empty except for a couple of wire hangers. The faded outline of my old dresser still marked the carpet, a ghost shape of what used to be mine. It felt strange, like walking into a memory that had been stripped down to bones. I set the basket on the floor and started unpacking from scratch. I hung my uniforms on one side of the closet, my civilian clothes on the other hand. I placed my boots in a neat row, toe caps, cleaned laces tucked. I set my dog tags on the nightstand, the metal clinking softly as it met the wood. Then I unpacked the 3 mementos that had survived the garage purge. The patch from my first rescue team, the folded letter from Torres who never made it home, the photograph of my unit taken in a dust storm, everyone squinting against the wind. I set each item down carefully, giving them space. They were not decorations. They were markers of where I had been and pieces of who I had become. For a long moment, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of everything settle. The silence in the house was thick. Not peaceful, not hostile, just vacant. Like everyone had retreated into their own corners to lick old wounds. Dad spent most of his time in the garage or on the back porch. Not the garage where I slept before, but the smaller one attached to the house where he'd kept tools for decades. Every time I passed through the kitchen to get coffee, I could see him through the window, pretending to sort nails or organize lumber that had not been touched in years. He avoided me without making it obvious, out of cold shoulder. More like a man ducking behind tall grass, hoping no one noticed he had shrunk. Maribel, on the other hand, kept her interactions functional. If we crossed paths in the hallway, she nodded politely. Nothing more. No attempts at apology or conversation. Her silence carried a kind of fragile dignity, as if admitting anything out loud might break her in half. Jason tried once to ask how I was doing. His words came out awkward, almost embarrassed. I told him I was fine. He nodded and disappeared upstairs. After that, he rarely spoke unless spoken to. We existed like distant planets orbiting the same sun. No collisions, no connections. A week later, I started my new job at the urgent care clinic. The first morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the name tag clipped to my scrub top. It felt strange wearing something so ordinary after years of tactical gear and flight suits, but it also felt good, grounded, real. When I walked out of the house, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table eating toast. He barely glanced at me. He muttered something that sounded like, "Take care," but I could not be sure. I decided to take it as a goodwill gesture, even if it was not meant that way. Driving to work felt like slipping into a new rhythm. The clinic buzzed with small emergencies, sprained ankles, high fevers, kids with stomach bugs. It was nothing like a field rescue. No rotor wash, no adrenaline spikes, no bodies suspended between life and death. But it was service, and it mattered. And people looked me in the eye and thanked me. They spoke to me as if I belonged somewhere again. In the afternoons when my shift ended, I sometimes sat in my car before driving home, letting the quiet settle around me. Civilization had a way of smoothing out edges I did not know I carried. Still, coming home each evening was the hardest part. The air in the house always felt heavy, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. No shouting, no arguments, just a mutual acceptance that the old hierarchy had ended and no one knew what the new one looked like yet. Dad rarely spoke. He moved around the house with the careful quiet of someone trying not to make noise in a church. Every time he passed me, he stiffened, like shame pressed a hand against his spine. Maribel stopped trying to reclaim space. She kept to the nursery and the bathroom and little else. Her footsteps on the hallway carpet sounded soft, almost apologetic. One evening after a long shift, I stepped outside onto the front lawn. The light was fading into gold. The grass bowed softly under the breeze. I looked down at the patch of land where my things had once been dumped, scattered across the yard like debris from a storm. For a moment I saw it again. The duffel bags ripped open. The uniforms were stained from dirt, the patches and dog tags lying exposed. The humiliation of that moment had been sharp enough to make my throat close. But now, standing there with the sun touching the tops of the trees, the memory felt different. Not distant, not numb, just transformed. It no longer hurts. It simply reminded me of something I should never forget. That the boundaries I drew were not walls to punish others. They were lines to protect myself, to preserve the woman I had fought to become. I bent down and ran my hand across the grass. It felt cool, soft, ordinary. Nothing remained of the chaos. No mark, no stains. Just earth doing what earth does best, covering what was broken and offering something new in its place. The breeze lifted my hair, and for the first time since the confrontation in the kitchen, I felt a quiet warmth in my chest. Something like acceptance, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, Just the calm understanding that not every family can be saved, but some parts of yourself can be. I stood up and looked at the house. Its windows glowed softly from the inside. The siding needed painting. The porch light flickered. The roof would need patching before the next rainy season. But it was mine, and I felt that truth down to my bones. I walked toward the front door, letting the screen door creak as I pulled it open. The hallway light cast a warm glow across the floor. The scent of dinner lingered faintly, though no one waited for me at the table. It was not a perfect home. It was not a healed home. But it was my home, and as I stepped inside with a steady breath, I carried with me a new kind of calm, not born from victory, but from understanding exactly who I was and what I stood for now. That feeling stayed with me as the door clicked shut behind me. I walked farther into the hallway, letting the familiar warmth of the lights pull me in, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not pride, not triumph. Just a quiet sense that the house was finally settling into its proper shape. I could breathe without waiting for the next accusation or tense silence or clipped comment. The air felt cleaner. My steps felt grounded. My presence finally felt like it belonged, not because anyone allowed it, but because it had always been mine. The next week passed with a rhythm that surprised me. I woke early for work at the urgent care clinic, drove through Tacoma streets still wrapped in morning fog, and returned home each evening to a house that felt a little less crowded, emotionally, even if the same number of people still lived in it. I kept to my routine without trying to provoke or avoid anyone. It was amazing how much peace grew inside a space once boundaries were spoken, allowed and held firm. Dad barely crossed paths with me anymore. He moved around the house like someone navigating unfamiliar territory, stepping lightly eyes down, careful not to disturb anything. Sometimes I caught him staring at the framed photo on the living room wall, the one taken when I bought the house. He never commented on it, but he lingered longer than he used to. Maribel spent most of her time upstairs. I heard her footsteps, but rarely heard her voice. Even Jason grew quiet, not from resentment, but from some new awareness settling in. The dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the daughter or sister who could be shuffled to the side without resistance. I was the homeowner, the provider, the one who held the structure of the household itself. No one said it, but the truth buzzed through the walls. I did not reinforce it through arguments or reminders or pointed comments. I simply lived within my own space like it was allowed. Because it was. Because it always had been. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find Dad standing in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee. He looked older than he had a month ago, his shoulders rounded, his eyes tired. He cleared his throat as I approached, as if preparing himself for a conversation he had avoided for too long. "Selena," he said, "we have been talking." His voice faltered for a moment. "Me and Maribel." I waited. "We think it might be best if we find a place of our own. Something smaller. Something more manageable." The words were quiet, but they filled the kitchen like steam rising from boiling water. They were not said with anger or bitterness. They were said with acceptance, like a truth finally landing in the right place. I nodded once. "If that is what you feel is right, I understand." He looked at the floor. "It is what is right. For all of us." His fingers tightened on the coffee mug. "I think we made things hard on you. Harder than we realized." The apology was not direct, but it was the closest thing he had ever offered in his life. I felt no need to push for more. A week later, they began packing. Slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. Boxes appeared in the hallway. Jason made trips to the car with folded blankets and kitchen supplies. Maribel wrapped baby clothes and tiny shoes in tissue paper. Dad gathered his tools from the garage. They did not ask me for help, and I did not insert myself. They moved through the process quietly, like people aware they were stepping out of a space they no longer had the authority to occupy. The day they left, it was raining lightly. I stood on the porch as they loaded the last box into the trunk. Maribel rested a hand on her belly, her face calm but unreadable. Jason gave me a polite nod. Dad paused at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me with a tight, hesitant expression. "You take care now," he said. "I will," I answered. He hesitated, then added, "This house suits you. Always did." It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I would ever get. I accepted it. When their car pulled away, the tires sent a soft spray of water into the air. I watched until the taillights faded at the end of the street. Then I stepped back into the house. My footsteps echoed differently this time. The walls felt lighter. The air was clearer. The house exhaled. That evening I cooked dinner for myself. Nothing special, just pasta with garlic and lemon. I sat at the kitchen table alone, not lonely, and listened to the steady hum of the refrigerator. There was no tension pressing against the walls. No second-guessing my presence. No shrinking myself to make room for others who never paused to ask whether I needed space too. I went to my room and opened the windows. A cool breeze swept in, carrying the scent of wet grass from the yard. I could see the patch where my belongings were once thrown like trash. The memory did not sting this time. It simply served as a marker. At the beginning of the line, I finally learned to draw. Revenge, I learned, was never about making someone suffer. Real revenge was choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. It was reclaiming the parts of you that had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was stepping into your rightful place without apology. Revenge for me was living in my own home with dignity instead of guilt. It was waking up each morning knowing I was not taking up too much space. It was resting each night, knowing I no longer allowed myself to be erased. As the weeks followed, my life became full in ways that had nothing to do with confrontation. I settled into my job at the clinic. The staff welcomed me warmly. Patients trusted me. I found comfort in routine and small tasks that grounded me. I planted a few flowers in the front yard. I repainted the entryway a warm shade of soft gray. I replaced the flickering porch light. And slowly the house began to feel like a true home again. Not the place where battles were fought. Not the place I returned to only to be pushed out. But the place where I chose myself fully. One quiet evening I stood again in the front yard. The grass brushed gently against my ankles. The sky was streaked with soft pink and orange. I looked at the house, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. I thought back to the girl I used to be. The veteran who returned home hoping to fit into the same patterns. The daughter who allowed herself to be treated like a visitor in the place she paid for. The woman who believed her needs were always second to everyone else's. That woman is gone now, and in her place stood someone stronger, someone clearer, someone who understood that taking back power did not always require shouting, or breaking or punishing. Sometimes it only required standing still in the truth. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The house held its quiet warmth around me, and at that moment I knew exactly who was in charge now. Not through force, not through fear, through clarity, through boundaries, through choosing myself without apology. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.